She had been sitting at the bar for 45 minutes when she decided she was done waiting. Not dramatically done. Not the kind of done where a woman throws a wine glass or storms out in tears. Just done, the quiet, heavy kind that settles into your chest like wet cement. Nora Whitfield set her glass of sparkling water on the polished mahogany bar, watched the tiny bubbles rise and die, and thought, I wore Spanx for this. She had ordered the water 3 times. The bartender, a young guy named Cole, who kept giving her that particular look, the one that said to stop checking his phone, had refilled it without being asked. A small mercy. The kind you get when you're visibly, publicly waiting for someone who clearly isn't coming. It was 9:47 p.m. The reservation at Cartier Social, one of Montreal's most coveted tables, had been for 9. The kind of place with no sign above the door, where the sommelier knew your name before you gave it, and where the waiting list stretched 6 weeks unless you had the right last name. Nora didn't have the right last name. She had been told Dominic had pulled strings. She had spent the better part of a Saturday hunting for the dress. A deep wine-red wrap that the woman at the boutique on Rue Saint-Denis had clasped her hands together over, saying in rapid Quebecois French that it was made for someone with real hips, real curves, that it would make people look twice. At $420, Nora had flinched. She worked in municipal tax compliance. $420 was not nothing, but she had bought it. She had bought the dress and the matching clutch and had stood in front of her bathroom mirror for 20 minutes doing and undoing her hair before her roommate finally walked in and said, "Just leave it down. You look incredible. Go." She had skipped dinner. Dominic had told her the tasting menu at Cartier Social was legendary 14 courses, and she wanted to actually enjoy it instead of picking at with the guilty restraint of someone who'd already eaten half a rotisserie chicken over the kitchen sink. So she had gone to her afternoon budget review meeting on nothing but a granola bar and determination. And now, here she was. Starving. Corseted. Alone. Her phone screen had gone dark for the last time 20 minutes ago. She had stopped refreshing his contact thread after the 7th check. Dominic Harker's last message had been from 3 days prior. "Can't wait to finally meet you in person, N," with the kind of exclamation mark that she now understood men like him deployed strategically. 6 weeks they had been talking, 6 weeks of good morning texts and late-night voice messages, and the kind of phone call where you lose track of time, and suddenly it's 1 a.m., and you're laughing in the dark. He had found her on a dating app, sent the kind of first message that was thoughtful, instead of lazy, asked real questions. He had made her feel like the most interesting person in the room. Even when she was sitting alone in her apartment, eating takeout in joggers, he had told her she sounded like a woman who didn't apologize for herself. She had nearly cried. Nora opened her phone one final time, not to check for his message. She blocked his number, and then she opened her texts to her best friend, Dawn, and typed, "He didn't show. I'm leaving. Do not ask me to explain tonight." She flagged Cole down, asked for the tab for her 3 sparkling waters, and the bread basket she had eaten out of pure misery at 9:30, and reached for her coat. She never put it on. The change didn't come loudly. It came the way a pressure drop comes before a storm, a sudden, absolute stillness that had no rational explanation. The soft ambient music that had been playing through the restaurant speakers, something low and French and vaguely jazzy, cut off, mid-phrase. The polished clinking of glassware stopped. The sommelier, who had been walking with the practiced confidence of a man who owned the floor he stood on, went rigid near the host stand and then stepped back 2 full paces. Nora looked him through the front entrance. 4 men came through the front entrance. They wore dark suits with the kind of tailoring that didn't come off a rack, and they moved through the room with a coordinated, practiced ease that had nothing to do with dining. Their eyes swept the space with professional efficiency. Nora watched the maitre d', a severe, silver-haired man who had looked through her like glass when she arrived alone. Men press himself flat against the wall. And then the man behind them walked in. He wasn't the tallest person Nora had ever seen, but he was the kind of tall that occupied a room differently than other people. Broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been drawn by someone who was angry about something. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie, his collar open one button, and he moved through Cartier Social like every square meter of it already belonged to him, which, Nora would later learn, was because functionally it did. She recognized him, not personally. She worked in municipal tax compliance, not organized crime. But she was a woman who read the news, and in Montreal, if you read the news carefully enough, you learned to read between the lines. You learned that certain names appeared in articles about federal investigation, and then disappeared from those same articles once the witnesses recanted. You learned to notice which real estate holdings in the plateau changed hands quietly every few years, which charitable foundations had boards populated by men with suspiciously clean records. Severin Voss. The name appeared in connection to shipping, to private equity, to a half-dozen legitimate-looking holding companies with offices in Laval and Luxembourg. The name appeared in the same paragraph as words like alleged and unconfirmed, and no charges were filed. In person, the alleged part felt very far away. One of his men stepped forward, his voice carrying across the frozen room without any apparent effort. Cartier Social is closed for a private booking. Please leave your meals and exit through the kitchen corridor. Do not stop. Do not look back. Your tabs are covered. What followed was not quite panic. It was more like the controlled implosion of an entire social contract. Wealthy Montreal professionals in designer clothes, abandoning $200 plates of duck confit, scraping back chairs, not making eye contact with each other or with anyone near the entrance. A woman in a cream blazer left her whole handbag on her chair and didn't go back for it. Nobody argued. Nobody complained. Nobody did anything except move toward the kitchen doors as quickly as their dignity would allow. Nora's hand was on her coat. Her legs did not move. She could not have explained it precisely, whether it was shock or some animal instinct that understood that sudden movement might draw attention, or simply the particular paralysis of a woman who had been invisible for the last 45 minutes and had somehow convinced herself she could remain so. Whatever the reason, she sat on her bar stool while every other person in the room emptied out, and she did not leave. In 90 seconds, Cartier Social was silent except for the kitchen staff huddled behind the pass, the low hum of the refrigeration units, the quiet hiss of the espresso machine, and Nora's own heartbeat. Severin Voss's eyes moved across the empty room. They stopped at her. He walked toward the bar, with the same unhurried stride he'd used coming through the door. His shoes made almost no sound on the hardwood floor. He was, Nora noticed with the slightly unhinged detachment of a person whose brain had decided to observe instead of process, extraordinarily good-looking in the way that cold things sometimes were. The St. Lawrence in February, a freshly sharpened blade. The moment before something breaks, he stopped at the bar. He looked at her empty stool beside her. The untouched seat where Dominic Harker was supposed to have been. Without asking, Severin Voss settled onto it. Up close, he smelled of cedar and something bitter and expensive, and underneath that, something metallic that Nora's nervous system catalogued automatically as danger. He looked at her face. He looked at her hands, which were, she noticed, gripping her clutch with enough force to leave marks in the leather. "You must be the analyst," he said. His voice was low, accented faintly with something she couldn't place. French, maybe, or something further east. He had the cadence of a man who never repeated himself. Nora's mind skipped like a scratched record. What? The analyst. He repeated it without impatience, as though he was simply correcting a transcription error. His eyes, she noticed, were a color she didn't have a clean word for. Not quite gray, not quite green, the color of the river on an overcast day. They were very still. I was told Dominic Harker was meeting his business associate here tonight, the woman who handles his secondary accounts. Dominic's name hit her like a cup of ice water to the face. Dominic, she said. Her voice came out wrong. Too thin, too careful. You know Dominic? Severin turned the empty wine glass in front of him once, a slow rotation. He's worked for my organization for 4 years. He managed a specific set of accounts. Private, offshore, significant. He managed them until 48 hours ago, when I discovered that a sum just under $3 million had been moved through a series of shell accounts he controlled. He paused. A sum that is no longer where it was. Nora stared at him. The pieces were assembling themselves in her mind with a terrible, grinding clarity. Dominic Harker, who had claimed to work in private wealth management. Dominic Harker, who had been so thoughtful, so interested, who had insisted on this specific restaurant, who had made her promise she'd arrive by 9 and wait for him, who had texted her obsessively in the week before tonight, asking if she still had her work laptop with her after hours. She'd thought he was making conversation about her job. She'd thought he found her interesting. She thought he had told someone he was meeting his partner tonight, a woman. At Cartier Social, he had given Severin Voss a location, bought himself time to run, and left a woman sitting alone at the bar to absorb whatever came through that door. The realization didn't arrive gently. It arrived like a fist. That absolute coward, Nora said. Her voice was quiet, which somehow made it worse. Severin raised one eyebrow. It was a small movement. On him it felt significant. He used me, she said, and her voice was still quiet, but it had picked up an edge now. The way quiet things do when they are about to stop being quiet. 6 weeks. 6 weeks of... He told me I was the first person in years who made him feel like he could breathe. Do you know what he said to me on our 3rd phone call? He said he'd never met a woman whose mind he actually wanted to know, he said. She stopped herself. I bought a $400 dress. I haven't eaten since noon. I told my mother I had a date. The last word came out with the particular devastation of something that had been held carefully for weeks and had just been dropped from a very great height. Severin was watching her with an expression she couldn't read precisely. It was not pity, which was something. It was not amusement either. It was attentive, calibrating. The way a man who spent his life reading rooms looked at something that didn't fit the room. You're telling me, he said slowly, that you have no professional connection to Dominic Harker. I reconcile quarterly tax filings for the city of Montreal. She opened her clutch, her hands moving on their own, and pulled out her work ID badge and dropped it on the bar. It landed face up. Nora Whitfield, Revenue Services Division. I met Dominic on Hinge. He liked 2 of my photos and sent me a message about a book I mentioned in my profile. He knew your organization had people watching him, so he arranged a very public blind date at a restaurant connected to your name and left me here as proof he was in the building, so you'd converge on this location while he went somewhere else. There was a silence. Behind Severin, one of his men, a lean, watchful man with a scar along his left jawline who had been standing at a careful distance, took a half step forward. Boss, she's a civilian, blind end. We should pull the cameras and redirect. Severin didn't look at him. He looked at Nora's ID badge. He looked at Nora. He looked at the way she was holding herself, spine straight, chin up, eyes furious rather than pleading, which was not what he had expected. He had in his career seen many people understand that they were in genuine danger. Most of them folded, they cried, they bargained, they made themselves smaller. Nora Whitfield had just gotten angrier. She had bought a $400 dress and skipped dinner and told her mother she had a date and had been used as cover for a money laundering scheme. She was staring at the most dangerous man in Quebec with the particular expression of a woman who ran out of patience for the evening. He knew my people were tracking his movements. Severin said, something shifting in his voice. Slower now, thinking out loud. He couldn't move the accounts digitally without leaving a trail my team would follow. He couldn't carry physical documentation without the risk of a search. So he created a reason for a woman to be here. Someone credible. Someone unremarkable. Someone nobody would look at twice, Nora said flatly. He looked at her. Severin stopped. He looked at her. That's what you were going to say, she continued, her voice very level, that he picked someone who'd blend into the background. Someone who wouldn't raise questions. Because who looks at the plus-size woman sitting alone at the bar? She picked up her water glass and took a sip and set it back down with the focused calm of a person keeping herself from throwing it. I was very useful to him, completely invisible and totally deniable, perfect prop. The man with the scar, she would later learn his name was Felix, shifted his weight again. Severin, give me a moment, Severin said, still looking at Nora. She looked back. She was not going to be the first one to look away. She had nothing left to lose tonight, which was a terrifying and oddly clarifying feeling. He told my lieutenant he was meeting his partner here, Severin said. The woman who holds the routing codes for the offshore transfers. He said she would bring the files. Something snagged in Nora's memory. She set the water glass down harder than she meant to. Files, she said. Severin waited. 2 weeks ago, Nora said slowly. Dominic asked me a favor. He said he was having trouble with his personal cloud storage limits or something, and he asked if he could temporarily store a large encrypted folder in my work drive. Said it was just financial documents. Boring stuff. He just needed somewhere to park it until he sorted out his storage issue. She pulled her work phone out of her clutch. Her hands were not entirely steady. I said yes because I'm a tax analyst, not a counter-terrorism officer, and it seemed like a perfectly normal thing a person might ask. I have the folder. It's still there. I never opened it because it was password protected and also because I had no reason to. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the ones before it. Felix said something in French, low and fast and profoundly emphatic. Severin rose from the bar stool. He was very close to her suddenly, not threatening exactly, but near enough that she could see the precise shade of grey-green in his eyes and the way they had changed. The cold stillness replaced by something much more focused and much more alive. He embedded the account routing data in a file he stored on the work drive of a municipal tax employee, Severin said quietly, because municipal servers have institutional encryption that my people don't sweep, because she had no connection to him professionally, because the file would sit there invisible for as long as he needed it to. He looked at her work phone in her hand. He didn't just use you as a decoy tonight, Nora. His voice was very quiet. He used you as the vault. She felt the blood leave her face, then come back. Then the white-hot clarity of pure rage settled over her like a second skin. Felix, Severin said, without looking away from her. Get the extraction team. They went to his building in a black SUV with tinted windows and a driver who seemed to be constitutionally incapable of making eye contact with anyone in the rear cabin. The Montreal streets were rain-slicked and empty. At that hour, the downtown towers blurring past, the orange glow of the streetlights, sliding over the glass in long amber ribbons. Severin sat beside her in the back seat. He had put his jacket around her shoulders in the doorway of Cartier Social without commentary, and she had been too stunned to object. It was absurdly heavy and warm and smelled like cedarwood and something darker, and she was acutely aware that she was riding in a bulletproof vehicle wrapped in a crime lord's jacket, which was not the evening she had planned. Where are we going? She asked. Somewhere my technical people can extract the file without touching your employer's server records, he said. It takes approximately 20 minutes. After that, you are free to go. And if I'd said no, you didn't. That's not an answer. He looked at her in the dark of the car, and for the first time she saw something flicker at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile but was the structural blueprint of one. I would have found another way, he said. I don't harm people who have done nothing wrong. You looked like you might when you walked into that restaurant. That was for the people who had done something wrong. She looked out the window at the wet street. Dominic, he has approximately a 3-hour head start, Severin said. My people are managing it. She didn't ask what managing it meant. His building. She never learned the address. The SUV descended into a private underground garage before she could orient herself. Was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something ostentatious. What she got was a penthouse that looked like it had been designed by someone who understood that the most expensive things in a room were the ones you didn't notice immediately. Concrete and oak, and floor-to-ceiling glass facing the river. Books. A lot of books, which surprised her more than anything else, arranged on a wall of custom shelves with the casual disorder of a person who actually read them. The view of the St. Lawrence was extraordinary, dark water and city light, and far away, the faint smudge of the South Shore. She sat on a deep charcoal sofa and held the glass of water someone brought her and watched 3 extremely calm, extremely efficient people do things to a laptop she didn't understand for 22 minutes. Severin stood across the room on the phone, speaking in rapid French she could only partially follow. His voice was different on the phone, clipped, authoritative, each word landing with the efficiency of someone who was accustomed to being understood correctly the first time. It's all there, one of the technicians said finally. Her name was Delphine, and she was the only one who'd introduced herself. Complete offshore registry, routing codes, shell structure, the entire framework. He was going to sell the whole architecture to a rival syndicate, give them the keys to empty the accounts and use the chaos to disappear. Can you trace where he was planning to send it? Severin asked. Already done, Delphine said. He has a contact in Vancouver. We have the IP. Severin said something very quiet in French. Then he looked at Nora. She was still sitting on the charcoal sofa with her coat across her lap. She had eaten the crackers someone had set on the coffee table in front of her without really deciding to, which she was slightly embarrassed about. She hadn't eaten since noon. The Spanks had become a philosophical enemy. She was sitting in the penthouse of an organized crime figure at midnight, having just inadvertently recovered $3 million of stolen money. And she was eating crackers. The file has been extracted from your drive, Severin said, crossing the room toward her. Your server records are clean. Nothing connects you to any of this. You can go home. He paused. But, she looked up. But, Dominic Harker knows your name, he said. He knows you were at that restaurant. If he contacts his Vancouver connection before we reach him, they'll know his cover was blown through the Cartier social operation. They may attempt to determine what happened to the file. The most obvious explanation is that I found it and handed it over, Nora finished. She pressed her fingers against her forehead. I know, I understand. She looked at the crackers. She looked at him. How would I need to stay until Harker is located? Hours, likely. A day at most. She nodded slowly. Then, is there any actual food in this building? Because I have been in Spanks since 7 o'clock, and I haven't eaten since noon, and I am going to lose my mind. Something moved across Severin's face that she was almost certain was genuine startled amusement, visible for approximately half a second before the controlled composure resettled. He turned to Felix and said something quiet. Felix disappeared. 40 minutes later, there was food. Real food. Not crackers, not courtesy chocolates, but actual plates from somewhere that was clearly still operational at midnight, which told her things about the reach of the man sitting in the armchair across from her. Duck, roasted potatoes. A salad she ate approximately none of, because it was not roasted potatoes. She ate without self-consciousness. which surprised her. She was usually careful, in front of new people, measured, strategic, the quiet management of how much space she took up and how visibly she enjoyed things. But she hadn't eaten since noons of a man who already knew she'd been used as a decoy and a digital vault, and there seemed to be very little left to manage. Severin watched her, not in a way that made her want to stop, in a way that was simply attentive. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm afraid of you," she said honestly, stabbing a potato. "I'm just also very hungry, and those two things are coexisting. Most people in this room at this hour are only one thing. Most people probably skipped the Spanx and ate dinner." She set down her fork. "Can I ask you something?" He waited. "Why did you put your jacket on me?" she asked. "In the doorway. You didn't have to do that." He was quiet for a moment. "You were shivering," he said, "and you had been treated very badly by someone who should have known better." He said it simply, without particular weight, which somehow gave it more. It was the least available correction. She looked at him for a beat too long, and then picked up her fork again. Her phone rang at 2:14 a.m. The screen read, "Unknown number." She looked at Severin, who had heard it from across the room. She could tell from the way his posture shifted, very slightly, toward her. He crossed to the sofa in 3 steps and gave her a single nod. She answered and put it on speaker. Nora. Dominic's voice was different than she remembered it. The warmth was gone, replaced by a stretched, urgent thing. The voice of a man trying to hold his own lie together, with both hands. "God, I'm so relieved. Are you okay? What happened at the restaurant?" She looked at the window. At the river. She took one breath. "I'm home," she said. "The restaurant got cleared out. Police, I think. Something was happening. Dominic, I've been trying to reach you all night. I was there for 45 minutes alone. I know, I'm so sorry. Something came up with work. A real emergency." The charm was a tool. She could hear it now with complete clarity, the practiced modulation of it, the way he calibrated concern versus urgency. "Listen, I need you to do something on your drive, that folder I few weeks ago. Remember? I need you to send it to me, right now. It's important." "Okay," she said carefully. "What's your email? I'll send it now." "Not email. I'll give you an upload link. Do you have your work laptop?" "I can get it." "What's going on, Dominic? You're scaring me." And there it was, the mask slipping the fraction of a second where the performance became impatient. "Just get the laptop, Nora. Stop asking questions. You wouldn't understand the situation, okay?" she said. "I'm getting it now. Can you just, while I'm looking, tell me why you didn't come tonight?" I sat there for 45 minutes. I was so embarrassed. "Because I had things to deal with that are a lot more important than a dinner," he said, and his voice had gone flat, the warmth stripped entirely away. "Listen to me. You're a smart girl, but you're out of your depth here. Just send the folder and I'll explain everything later." A smart girl. She looked at the window. Severin was beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, his hand resting on the back of the sofa behind her. When she glanced at him, his eyes were on her, not on the phone, on her. As though the call was secondary to whatever he was reading in her face. "Dominic," she said, and her voice had changed. "I want you to hear me. I'm not sending you the folder. Soon. I don't have the folder anymore. And I want you to know that sitting alone at that restaurant for 45 minutes in a $400 dress that I bought because you told me I was worth showing up for. That was the last time I will ever make myself small for someone who was counting on me not to notice I was being used." Silence on the line. "We have him," Felix said from across the room, his hand over his own phone, his eyes on Severin. Vancouver Contact's phone just lit up. Dominic tried to send an alert. "He's at a motel in Brossard, 40 minutes south." Severin reached across Nora and ended the call. He didn't move away. He stayed where he was, very close, looking at her with the same focused attention he'd had since the bar, except that the calculation in it had become something else. Less measured, more certain, the look of a man who has been making assessments for a long time and has just arrived at a conclusion. "You didn't have to say any of that," he said. "He already couldn't touch you." "I know," she said. "I said it for me." Something in his expression shifted. Not the controlled diplomat of violence composure, something quieter and more private than that. "Felix," he said, without looking away from her. "Take 2 cars to Brossard, bring him back." "And the girl?" "Nora stays," Severin said. His voice was entirely even. "He's been through enough tonight. She doesn't need to be there." It was another hour before Felix's car came back. Nora had fallen asleep on the charcoal sofa, not gracefully, not on purpose, but in the boneless way that happens when adrenaline drains and the body simply stops negotiating. She woke to the soft sound of the penthouse elevator opening and the low murmur of voices in French. Severin was sitting in the armchair across from her, his jacket off, the first 2 buttons of his shirt open, reading something on his phone. He looked up when she stirred. "It's handled," he said. She sat up and pushed her hair back and looked at the windows. The sky over the river was beginning to change color, the deep black giving way to a dark, bruised blue at the horizon. She had a meeting at 9. She had 37 unread messages from Dawn. "Is he?" She started. "He is not your concern any longer," Severin said. She accepted this. She thought about Dominic Harker and his careful warmth, and his perfect questions, and the 45 minutes she had spent staring at her phone in a 5-star restaurant, and the 6 weeks she had spent feeling, for the first time in a long time, like someone worth finding. She thought about his voice on the phone going flat and blank. The moment the pretense stopped being useful. She didn't cry. She had thought she might once the adrenaline finished. She found she was simply tired and very clear, and in some hard-to-articulate way, lighter. "You should know," Severin said, "that your name will not appear anywhere in connection with tonight. My people are thorough. As far as anyone is concerned, you were at Cartier Social for a dinner reservation that was evacuated due to a private booking. That is all. My tax compliance manager is going to ask why the server showed a large encrypted file accessed after hours," she said. "It won't," he said. "Delphine is very good." She looked at him. "You did all of that for someone you met 90 minutes ago." "I did it," he said, "because you walked into a situation that was built to harm you, and you handled it with more composure than most of my lieutenants would have. And because Dominic Harker made a mistake that I consider personal, using me as a vault. Using you," he said, "as though you were something that could be used." The elevator arrived. Felix stood at the doors, holding them, his expression professionally neutral. Nora gathered her coat and her clutch. She was still wearing his jacket. She realized she had slept in it. She began to take it off. "Keep it," Severin said. He had stood from the armchair. He was very tall from this angle, or maybe she was just aware of him differently at 5 in the morning, in the grey-blue light before the city woke up. "I can't keep your jacket," she said. "It gives me a reason to return it to you," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the first pale edge of morning was arriving over the St. Lawrence, the river going from black to a deep blue-grey, the South Shore lights beginning to dim against the coming day. She kept the jacket. She was in the elevator, the doors beginning to close, when his voice came through. "Nora," she put her hand on the door. "You said you were invisible," he said from across the room, his hands in his pockets, his voice carrying the same quiet precision it always did. "That he chose you because no one would look twice." She waited. "I have been looking at you since the moment I walked into that restaurant," he said. "I expect I'll have a great deal of difficulty stopping." The doors closed. In the black SUV moving through the early morning streets of Montreal, Nora Whitfield held Severin Voss's jacket across her lap and looked out at the city and thought, "I wore Spanx for the wrong man." She laughed. Unexpected, genuine, a little wild. and Dawn's name was already on her screen before the car had crossed Rue Sherbrooke. What would you do if you walked into the worst night of your life and came out the other side holding the keys to an empire? Let us know in the comments. If this story kept you up past your bedtime, hit that like button, share it with someone who deserves a good story, and subscribe to Broken Throne for more.